1. Back when I was attending university, I used to work on campus at one of the dining halls during the dinner and night shift. I lived in the next town over, since it was cheaper to live in a crappy little apartment out of town than to live on campus in the dorms. But I didn't own a car, so I had to take the bus. One night I had just gotten off a shift at work. My feet were killing me and I was completely exhausted as I slowly made my way to the bus stop. I noticed a man much older than me sitting on one of the two benches at the otherwise empty bus stop, but I didn't pay too much attention to him. I simply sat down on the second bench and listened to some music while waiting for the bus to arrive. The first sign things were starting to get weird was when I kept noticing out of the corner of my eye that he was staring at me. At first I thought I might be imagining it, so I looked over and caught him quickly turning his head to look away. Okay, so he was staring at me. That wasn't completely out of the ordinary, since being a young college girl seemed to gain me a bit of attention from older men, so like usual I just ignored him. That was a mistake. Again, out of the corner of my eye I saw him look at me, but instead of just staring this time he got up and walked over to sit next to me instead. I continued listening to my music, hoping that he'd see the earbuds and take the hint that I wasn't interested in having a conversation. Instead, this man literally took the earbud out of my ear. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said as my head snapped to look at him in shock. I should have told him off for touching my things and demanded he leave me alone, but I was sort of frozen and didn't want to make him mad. Hi," I replied quietly. He started introducing himself as Mike and telling me that he lived in the area, and that it was always nice to see pretty girls like me at the university bus stop. He explained that he was a real man, unlike the boys I went to school with, and that I should go home with him that night. I was a shy, scared virgin who had never had a man be so bold as this to my face. I say to my face because I'd certainly got my fair share of unsolicited private pictures online by that point, but I digress. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. But that didn't stop Mike from continuing to explain to me all the fun things he wanted to do with me at his place that night. He got into graphic detail. The things he described started with the basic things you'd expect, and escalated to him asking if I'd like being choked until I turned purple and passed out in bed. I wished there were anyone else at that bus stop, but it was just the two of us, in the dark alone, as I counted the seconds until the bus would arrive. Then Mike took things to a different level of shocking by telling me, "Listen, the demons want me to ask you for your phone number, and they say you should give it to me or you won't like what happens." He actually had the audacity to start stroking my hair. His hand was gentle, but I didn't want him touching me at all. This was shocking for a number of reasons. The demons? I wouldn't like what would happen. Why was he touching me? What the hell was this guy talking about? As though he could read my mind, Mike went on to explain. "My therapist knows the demons are real. I told her about them, and she says I'm not crazy and the demons are real." "Now give me your phone number like they said," he demanded, and his hand stroked my hair for the last time. He stopped and gripped the back of my neck, still gentle, but even more terrifying. I was scared and obviously didn't want him to have my phone number, but he was taking out his phone, and I knew that he was going to call the number I gave him to make sure I wasn't lying to him. And he still had his hand on the back of my neck, so I reluctantly gave him my real phone number. Stupid, I know. But I was right, and he immediately called to check. All I could think about was just not making this guy angry long enough to get away from him, then I'd block his number. Thankfully, the bus came moments later. I sat down as close to the front of the bus near the driver as I possibly could, since the bus was basically empty. Mike decided to sit directly across from me. At this point, I had tried listening to music again, hoping that being on the bus and him having my phone number would signal to him the end of our conversation. However, he decided to reach over and unzip my sweatshirt, revealing my work shirt and name tag, which I had unfortunately forgotten to remove in my haste to leave work that night. I hadn't told him my name yet. Abigail, what a beautiful name. Our daughter will be named Celeste. I shouldn't have been shocked at this point, but I was. I stopped listening to music again and zipped my sweatshirt back up, which made him laugh. He won't need that soon anyway, he said and winked at me, implying how he'd planned to undress me even further that night. At one point, Mike tried to convince me to get off the bus with him. I told him no, that I was tired and just wanted to go home. So he said okay and stayed on the bus. I knew that had been his stop, so the fact that he was staying on the bus worried me. I was sure this meant that he was planning on coming home with me instead. "Baby?" Mike whispered to me. I tried to ignore him, but he repeated himself louder. "Baby." He had the most unsettling smile on his face as I asked, "What?" He laughed as he told me, "The demons say you smell nice." I was terrified and felt like I was going to throw up by the time my bus stop arrived. I lived in an apartment alone and didn't want him to know where I lived. Despite my body being exhausted and sore from work, adrenaline kicked in and I bolted off the bus and ran straight home. I made it inside and locked the door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see him, so I went to carefully peek out of my window and saw him standing near the bus stop looking around. He took out his phone and sure enough I started getting a call from an unknown number since I hadn't saved his number. I ignored it. When he hung up, I started getting several texts asking where I'd gone, how he didn't like hide and seek, and how the demons just wanted to have fun but I was being a little bitch about it. I was so scared because he knew which apartment building I lived in, where I worked, where I went to school, my phone number and my name. The only good thing which made me feel slightly relieved was that he didn't know which specific apartment number I lived in. That's when he started yelling outside. There were no specific words said, just wordless yells of what I can only assume were frustration and anger. I blocked his number and kept all the lights in my apartment off as I cried with my back to the front door. Maybe I should have called the police, but my brain was so frazzled that I didn't even think of that until the next day, and by then, all I knew about him was that he was a mentally unstable man, probably named Mike, who hadn't actually done any physical harm to me, so I didn't think it was worth it. In hindsight, I know that I made a lot of stupid mistakes during this experience. I ended up moving away entirely at the end of that term of school for unrelated reasons. But until then, I switched to day shifts at work and was paranoid every night. Thankfully, I never saw the man again, though. So Mike, the scary guy from the bus stop who tried to follow me home, I never want to meet you or your demons ever again. 2. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in. And at first appearances, my housemate and landlord Mike was somewhat normal, if not a bit socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the papers, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I thought was odd. But I really needed a place to stay, and, well, people have their little quirks, so I chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike and our cohabitation continued, I learned more about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, that he used meth. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He was probably the first person I knew who used meth and balanced a full-time job, enjoyed a decent amount of success. The reason this is important to the story is that when he would be around the house drinking and using meth, he would start to run off at the mouth. He would often joke that if I smelled lye coming from the basement, not to think anything of it. I think it was probably the third time he said this that I asked why he keeps saying that, and he said, "I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies," with a wily grin on his face. I tried to chalk it up to a bad sense of humor, but it didn't sit right with me. He was also very particular that I let him know of my coming and going, and my work schedule. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day that I ended up taking off of work, because he didn't realize that I was home. I remember that day because there was a lot of clanging and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he was not in the main house or his bedroom. Other days he would play very loud music that bumped through the whole house. Sometimes he would even play NPR talk radio at those volumes. In retrospect, I think he may have been trying to mask sounds. He would make remarks about sex workers saying, "You can do whatever you want. You can choke them or beat them to death and nobody cares." I took exception to this. I told him I thought that was messed up. But when he would get tweaking, he'd always come back to alluding to the same kind of violence, talking about how he was a normal white guy who owned a house and had a good career, so the police would never suspect him. At this point, I start to think that it has gone too far to simply be a joke. I was in a weird position because money was tight at the time and my options were few. I tried to convince myself that even if he is messed up, he is probably just engaging in outward fantasism. I knew that he would acquire the services of sex workers on occasion, but again, did not judge that activity at face value, but started becoming concerned. Then at one point, when I was doing laundry, I caught whiffs of decomposition. The house we were in was in southeast Portland. It was relatively new. Having grown up in upstate New York, I know that animals can be trapped in walls and die, but this was the garage, and there were no animals scurrying in the walls. This was strange and telling to me. I considered carefully what I would do, and decided I would confront him about the smell. I decided to pose the question in a somewhat suggestive way, by expanding on his jokes. I told him that he needs to do a better job cleaning up the bodies because I smell decomposition from the garage. I will never forget his reaction. His eyes widened, and he shot me a sharp glare, somewhat between fear and anger. He stumbled over his words and eventually responded, "What, really?" I said, "Yes, really." And there were a few seconds of awkwardness before he said, "Thanks for letting me know," and promptly went into his bedroom and shut the door. A few days after that, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage one day, while I was again doing laundry. He called for me and was trying to convince me to come up into the crawl space. My body locked up like it was my instinct screaming at me that if I went up there I would not come back down. I gave some excuse that I can sparsely remember that I had to be someplace, packed up my laundry, threw it in my room, and left. He spent a lot of time in the padlocked basement without a doorknob. The only way in was through the backyard. I wish I would have gone down there in retrospect, to either confirm or dismiss the suspicions once and for all. In the last couple months I lived there, I was privy to more graphic comments about women and sex workers, explicit talk of sexual violence, and he was using more and more. He once showed me a video he made, he is a graphic designer and artist as well, which featured heavy bondage themes interspersed with distorted audio of women screaming, and this strange, leering figure in a plague doctor costume. It was one of those situations where any one of those things alone may be innocuous, but as they accumulated it became suspicious to me. It was October of 2016 that I left there, taking off to a Setio Oyate camp during the anti-pipeline protests with Standing Rock, Lakota. A mix of feeling called to action and having nothing to lose, as I wanted to get out of that house in the worst way. My last night there, I did not give notice that I was leaving. He was drinking and tweaking again. Started in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and sexual violence in the tone of some sort of edgy joke. I told him that he would be caught eventually, not even holding back my suspicion anymore. He reiterated that he was the last person police would suspect, and asserted that they wouldn't catch him. He said this in a very serious and concise way, dropping the pretense that he had been using before. I left the next morning. This haunted me for months, then a year and a half. I felt as though I hadn't done anything and the guilt was eating away at me. So I called Portland Crime Stoppers and put in an anonymous tip describing what I described here. When I did, the operator started going back and forth, putting me on hold, because the call had piqued the interest of the police sergeant who was assigned to the call center. So they were asking me detailed questions about his vehicle, his house, the methods he described, etc. It seemed like they took interest. I gave them as much information as I could remember and left it at that, feeling just a little better that I had at least tried to do something about it. Fast forward to recent times, I told my mother about all of this, and she became interested, asking what house this was, and she ended up pulling it up on G-Maps. She put up the street view, and I noticed that there was a large enclosed trailer in the driveway that wasn't there when I was. I could theorize why it might have been there, but cannot put together a practical reason for it, or why he'd be using it. Unless he was moving or using it to haul things to discard. Admittedly, that is pure conjecture, but I couldn't help but wonder. I doubt that I will get closure or have my suspicions validated, unless he does finally get caught and arrested, and I read about it. I have grown up poor and been around the low life a lot. I have interacted with many sketchy and unsavory people in my time, but none of them have ever made the impression that Mike made on me. Make of it what you will, but I hope I never meet him again. 3. As a female who's been on the game World of Warcraft for 15 years now, I've met a load of creeps, but only a few made me feel unsafe. To start off, I've always had a laptop since I was in high school, a luxury back then. I worked hard to earn enough to buy one. My mom almost took my money I earned for drugs, but luckily, money I made in tips were in cash, so it was easier to hide it from her. At first my mom was mad I bought myself a laptop, but she soon forgot like everything. My dad could care less, and my older brother already has his own, so I started playing WoW with him at 14, and back then, girls were unheard of. So I got the usual creeps who usually backed off after hearing my age, or they were young too. But not this guy. This guy loved that I was underage. I was about 16, and used to creepy guys at this point. No longer a noob at the game, or fending off the creeps, it was no surprise a new guy in the guild started hitting on me. Now I was 16, dumb, young, horny, and stupid, but I knew I wasn't going to find love on WoW, where you knew no one in real life. Plus I had the ultimate crush on a guy I knew I couldn't have, because he was my brother's best friend. But in my mind back then, I only wanted him. So it was easy to turn guys down despite being desperate as hell for one guy. But that all changed after my brother's friend went off to college. I had a part-time job with my brother's friend, but girls at work surrounded him, and I became demoralized I'd never find love. Cue 19-year-old guy on WoW who made me feel wanted. I had a camera phone, so I could send and post pictures at that age, and back then I mostly used Facebook, MySpace, and Photobucket. I lost a lot of weight in my sophomore year, so I posted confidently bikini pics and sexy pictures, thinking I'd lure the attention of my brother's friend, who was 19. So when this guy, who was also 19, liked me, it didn't faze me. He looked the part in his photos, and his younger brother was my age, so I thought. He was extremely attractive in his photos, and even proved it was him in his pictures by holding items I asked for. He started paying my WoW subscription, which in the long run I realized it was to get my home address and real name. I was so stupid and heartbroken over my brother's friend. Years of teaching myself online safety and the ability to be strong against flirts was all but lost in the fog. We talked for hours on Ventrilo, and he'd make me feel pretty. I was completely blinded by this point. He sent me gifts, and I didn't even question how he had my address. Then he offered to drive and pick me up, and only then did I suddenly get cold feet. I had a good friend on WoW, someone my brother met at PAX who joined the guild, and is still one of my best friends to this day, though we both aren't fond of my older brother. He's 6 years older than me, though he never creeped on me, was more like a protective brother I lacked. Well, at least till I was 24 and single for the first time did we hook up, but that's because we were friends for so long. But the distance led to it not turning into a relationship. He caught on to it through conversation and was my words of wisdom in a time I was lacking any of my own. He saw something was fishy when I couldn't. I told my friend I was scared to meet him because, dumb teenager logic, I thought he would kill me. My friend chimed in that I shouldn't meet anyone off the internet at my age. I told him about the gifts, and I swear I've never been scolded like this in my life, not even by my own parents. But he always cared like that. He wondered why I would give my address to someone I never met, and the expensive gifts I got were not something the average 19-year-old could afford. None of this ever clicked for me, of course, because I was lonely and trying to prove, I don't know, to myself, my crush or something, I could get a boyfriend. Like that, I told the guy it wasn't wise to meet in person, and my parents said I wasn't allowed to. That's when it went dark. At first it was pestering over and over, guilting me over gifts he gave me and encouraging me to defy my parents, while he kept bothering me. It never occurred to me he'd lose his shit. While my friend was worried shitless about the guy having my address, going so far as to drive 11 hours to my house, and explain the situation to my dad as I refused to tell him out of fear of getting in trouble at the time. All while taking his spring break in my state instead of his own with his friends. There's a reason he's still one of my best friends. He has a little sister of his own as well, and she's my age, so his protective nature is natural. Eventually he made me block the guy, and that was that. This guy was pissed off. He'd go onto different accounts and accuse me of gold digging and using him. Luckily, my friend was smart enough and had the foresight to change my WoW password, and even paid for my account for me by taking this guy off it entirely, as one of this guy's threats was to delete my account. But it didn't end there. It got worse as he'd occasionally find ways to message me and tell me how horrible I was, till about a month had passed. I was walking home from school, about a 2-mile walk in wealthy suburbs of New England, which I'd done for years. Many kids did, as it was a very safe town with no crime in it or surrounding towns. Without a second thought, I took off my 100-pound backpack, maybe an overestimate, put my headphones in and started my 20-minute walk home. It was cold, so I had earmuffs over my headphones, only drowning out sound more so. I swear if I could talk to myself as a kid, I would probably slap myself for stupidity, because WoW Guy knew I walked home every day as I talked about it. He knew my address, and I never thought twice. I was on back roads walking home, and honestly, easy to map from my school to home, as it was pretty straightforward with only one turn. At halfway home, in between songs, I heard a vague, crunching sound of tires rolling over gravel on the road slowly. I turned around to see a tinted black car that you couldn't see much of the person in front of. I jogged out of the driveway I was standing in front of, assuming it was wanting to turn in, but it didn't turn in. The roads were dead, and it didn't make sense for him not to go around. I swear the saying that you go cold when you're terrified is absolutely true. It could have been a summer's day at 95 degrees, my bones would have been cold. My heart just sank, and my breathing was uncontrollable. I felt like I had no control over my body as I realized this guy was following me. My blood truly ran cold, and my hands shook as tears formed and my skin felt tight. My body felt like it wasn't ready to fight or flight, but simply freeze and die there. It only got worse, as the second time I turned my head to see the car stop, I stopped. My world stopped. I couldn't stop staring, just froze and breathing like all my school books were on my chest. Crying silently, my eyes hurt with no tears or sound, as I just stood there. The door opened after what felt like hours, but only seconds, maybe a minute, and it was in fact him. It was the attractive guy from the photos, not a catfish, but something seemed different. At first I thought it was his angry expression, but soon realized he was definitely not 19, more like 30 plus. I could barely think over the loud sound of my heart racing as it froze me in place. I thought I was about to throw up as he spoke to me, told me to get in the car or he'd light my house on fire and kill my dog in front of me. I honestly just couldn't move, couldn't reach for my phone as his words just froze me. And like some magic, we both failed to notice the little old lady on her porch watching this play out. Suddenly I hear her yell, "Get away from that girl right now before I burn you alive!" We both turned to meet her eyes, pissed off small lady about 60 or 70 with white hair. I think she noticed my frozen in fear state, as she told me to get over to her quickly. Like that, I ran over to her, tossing off my heavy brick of a backpack. It was obvious he was unsure what to do next, as he stood there and watched me run to her. Must have been a sight with this tiny thin old lady standing in front of a teenage girl, yelling at this man to go away. Like that, Savior number 2 joined the battle as her husband stepped out. Guy looked like he'd been through a war or two, with a shotgun of all things and a booming voice. Gun pointed, saying, "I've shot and killed men for less reason, you better leave now." He got into his car and drove off as I simply collapsed. All that fear just came out as I cried harder and harder, as my brain sifted through the past few months of mistakes. After calming me down enough to speak in non-hyperventilating words, she asked me if I knew him. I told her, kind of, but only online from a video game, not real life. Of course, explaining it wasn't easy, and her husband couldn't grasp why I'd want to pretend I was at war. I'm sure in his experience he was thinking Call of Duty, not magical creatures in a game called World of Warcraft. She got on the phone with the school counselor, her daughter apparently, and told her my name. I was well known to her daughter, ironically, but it was only 250 kids or less in the school, and the town itself was small. Many staff at our school had family in town. Kids at school that were related to either by their own children or their siblings' children. It was the kind of town if you didn't leave by a certain age you were stuck there. So honestly it seems ironic, but entirely not a huge surprise. The counselor was aware of my family and my mom's drug addiction, as child services had been involved a few times. She came by in 10 minutes to pick me up, and asked me a ton of questions, of course, knowing I didn't want to involve the police as I was scared of being taken away from my parents again. FYI, foster care was worse than a drugged-out mom on prescriptions. We weren't rich, but we were more well off than many. Though my mom worked, my dad kept her on a tight budget to keep her from buying prescriptions from Canada that she wasn't prescribed, hence her trying to take my money. She knew all of this, and knew, though it was rough, I was better off there than in foster care, which was a gamble with losing odds at best. Plus 2 more years and I'd be off to college anyway, so we didn't involve the cops. She made me promise to take the bus every day, and to inform my dad of the situation. She also called my dad at work to inform him, and had a teacher make sure I got on the bus every day till I graduated even. It really sucked, but I understood. If it ended there, it would be nice. But you can see how long this video is, so let's move on. 2 days after this, my dad had to fly out for business. But my brother was off at college, so it left me with my high mom, who promised my dad to stay sober while he was gone, but I was used to helping her while she was high. It was like taking care of a child. But I was on edge as ever. Stuck in that big house from the 60s, cats stirring at night. The dog barking outside set me on edge, so I barely slept. My friend from WoW called every night, making sure I was okay for the past month. I lived in the middle of the woods next to a huge river in my backyard, so there was still a lot of wildlife outside in the dead silence of cold months. Running water is an important source of water when lakes freeze. I had been used to all the bumps in the night, cats coming and going, and dog barking at every animal in the yard. But it seemed new to me as I laid in bed, trying to drown out my fears. The house I grew up in was a 6-bedroom house. I had a little sister too, but she stayed with my grandma in another state, per court order, while I was allowed to choose due to her being only 9 and me being 16. The other rooms were used as a game room, office for my dad, and guest room, mostly for when my sister visited. My grandma and her had a room. So in a large house like that in the middle of the woods, it was scary to virtually be alone because my mom accounted for defenseless. I was letting my last cat in for the night. 5 cats, so all knew to come in at night for dinner and stayed in till morning. And at the end of the long driveway between my neighbor and our house was a parked black car. I quickly shut the door and locked it after my cat got inside. I made sure all 5 doors were locked and even put cardboard on the glass doors to the pull. I don't know, hoping if he broke them it would delay him, if that car was his. I went and turned off all the lights and got all my cats into one room so I knew they were safe. Here's the thing about my dog. He's untrained for the most part, but was basically a giant lab puppy in his mind. But he growled at strangers, not barked like at animals. We had to keep him outside if we had guests, but he never bit anyone, and if you spent enough time around him, he'd eventually accept you. And he didn't growl at all strangers either, so he wasn't the most reliable guard dog either. But he was big, and with a deep bark. I mulled over what to do as I sat there in the dark with my dog, waiting for a shadow to pass by the window. I eventually went upstairs to my mom's room and woke her up from her sleeping pills slumber. Groggy and still kinda high, she didn't quite grasp what I was telling her until I started crying. She sort of sobered up, and asked me to get her some coffee, and I did. All while I'm watching my dog's every move, because I know he could sense something before I did. As my mom sobered, the fear in her eyes grew. Eventually, she got the idea to call my neighbors and ask them if they knew the car. After all said no, 2 of the men went out of their house to check the car together. The car was empty. At closer inspection, though, they noticed it was a newer car, a Lexus, and in the passenger seat was a laptop. The car was locked, but with a flashlight you could see somewhat into the tinted windows. They never told us why, but something they saw in the car prompted them to call the local sheriff. Only one, and he lived in town sort of thing. We were too small to have a police department. He drove over about 15 minutes later, ran the plates, and asked the houses around about it. Apparently it was a rental car from Ohio, and he was calling to see who it was rented to, but the offices were closed, I think. He stuck around in his car for about an hour till someone came out of the woods and ran back in as the cop turned his spotlight on him. I couldn't see what he was pointing at with his light, as it was the side of my house and I was looking at the front. I guess the cop called for backup as 3 other cop cars showed up in 5 minutes of it from the neighboring town and highway patrol, I think. I don't know. At which a lady cop got out, as I asked to speak with her, and called my counselor at school to explain who that might be. I was pretty shy back then, but I don't know, something about a female cop made me feel more comfortable to open up to. I told her the gist of the story, then she called my counselor who backed up my story, but also explained why I was scared of cops, because of my history with foster care and not wanting to go back. At which a mostly sober mom joined me, hugging me, doing her typical apologetic routine, but also offering much-needed comfort as she called my dad too. Eventually, the lady cop asked if she could take a look around the house to see if things were secure and get any information from my laptop about him. In her search, she found something I didn't think about checking. The basement door was not just unlocked, but open. It's never unlocked, so I didn't even think to check it, as our backyard floods in the spring due to beaver dams, and it's got extra seals and stuff to prevent the basement from flooding. Again, but the stuff sealing it, which was mostly sandbags and stuff, were set aside. But the door at the bottom of the stairs was locked still, though it had some damage like someone tried picking it. But he had access to half the basement that was storage. Basement was sectioned off, and the other half used to be for my brother's parties. The door between the sections was like a front door, not an indoor door. As in the summer, my dad left the hatch open to dry out the basement and adjust pool settings, as it was basically the pool house, and the cats loved it, so it also had a few cat beds. The section that led upstairs was locked from the inside, and the wall and door were not drywall and cheap door, but lock and key heavy door, and wall was brick. Upon noticing this, my dad confirmed he had not left it open. My suspicions that black car was his were pretty much confirmed. As we walked through the house to make sure everything was still safe, she got on my laptop as they searched the woods. I gave her everything I had, his photos, username, and she even checked to see if his credit card was still in my account, but it wasn't. But the last few digits were. Then she asked to take my laptop for a few days, as she thought she could get some good evidence from it. I asked her to please not damage it and return it as soon as possible because I used it a lot. Before smartphones, it was all I had. After a few hours, onlooking neighbors had gone to bed. The cops came back empty-handed, but left a cop outside our house and towed the guy's car. From what the lady cop told me, what prompted such fear in the car was there was 2 guns, some sort of rope and handcuffs, and the guy who ran back into the dense woods was wearing a winter ski mask. Not out of season, but suspicious nonetheless. So eventually I try and lay down and go to sleep, but pretty sure I was going to call out sick tomorrow and keep all my cats inside for the day. I was too restless to sleep. Every sound made me so scared. My mom slept with the dog in her room. I'm very allergic to animals, but less to cats, as I kinda built up a tolerance to cats but not dogs. And my cats slept in my room most nights, by choice, as my room was usually the warmest. At 3:30 a.m., I heard a knock at the back door, and the guy say, "Undercover police officer, open up!" I was still awake as I walked downstairs to make out a guy standing in the dark with a gun. As he saw me, he demanded I let him in now, as he needed to speak with me. Something felt off. My gut knew it before I did, that this guy's voice seemed forced, like someone purposely making their voice deeper. And why was he at the back door? So I turned on a light outside, and sure enough, it was him. I just screamed, and as quickly as I screamed, he started hitting the door hard. Wasn't a very loud horror movie scream, but more like a gasp scream. I don't think the fear in my body had a loud scream to let out. But the banging was pretty loud as I ran to the front to see if the officer was still outside. He was, but he wasn't getting out of his car. I didn't want to run outside as I'm not a fast runner, so I turned the porch lights on and off a couple times. But still nothing. After a minute, my dog came bolting down to the door, barking and growling, nearly foaming at the mouth. Soon followed my mom, who yelled she had a gun. She didn't, but bluff is bluff. Somehow, during all this, the cop outside had snuck around back and had his gun pointed at him, yelling to put his gun down. I hid as the rest went down, but he was arrested. No trial needed me to attend, and my statement was enough. Come to find out, he wasn't even American. The car was rented under his friend's name, and after all was done, he was deported back to Canada. I assumed something with his passport would prevent him from coming back to the USA, as the cop reassured me that he couldn't come back to the USA now. I don't know exactly what he was charged with, but I think my dad said aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, and something else. And it also turned out he was 32 years old and not 19, so I assume me being a minor carried a charge. And life moved on from there. I had plenty of creeps before and after, but he was by far the worst from WoW. I had a couple from streaming, but I was an adult and much better at staying safe online. Only one worse than this guy was my ex-boyfriend's cousin who made my life hell for a couple years. But that's another story for another time. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 534. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Also like to give a special shout out to Reddit user Loganatch? Yeah, Loganatch. The author of the second story there saved the video actually. Swooped in at the last moment with the save. The story about the ex-housemate who may have been a potential serial killer. Although I do think Mike was a little cocky in assuming that because he fits the exact profile of a serial killer that he wouldn't be caught. Because they do have people that, you know, there's profilers, that's what they do. And their job is to work up who they think the killer is. And, well, most serial killers, at least in the US, are single white guys. And I'm sure there's other factors in there too. Although most of them aren't drug addicts, are they? Probably worth looking into. So assuming he was actually guilty of what he confessed and wasn't, you know, just making meth and naughty movies in his basement, yeah, he's probably going to get caught eventually. Anyway, with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.